Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is April 26, 2018, and this is episode 83. Politicos is your weekly politics recap with a West Coast perspective. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you found us. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticosPod, and support the show at patreon.com/Politicos.
I'm Scott Delane-Boom.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, we're talking about Kinder Morgan, again, of course, the new cannabis bills here in BC, and how apparently electoral reforms is probably not actually going to happen again. First, though, we have to thank our premier sponsors, Lindsay Teds and Blake Hodson, for helping make the show possible. And Politicos is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's brand new daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for your free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners receive 25% off subscriptions when you enter the offer code Politicos. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to britishcolumbiatoday.ca. First up, Mr. Horgan goes to court. Today, the BC government announced its long-awaited reference question, which was the peace offering to Rachel Notley to end the wine war, which Rachel Notley actually reminded us this week is only suspended. She could at any time, according to her, reinstate a ban on BC wines.
So this is kind of like Korea, in other words.
We're in an armistice right now. Of course, now the Alberta government's also looking at shutting off the oil taps. So the reference question centers around proposed amendments to the Environmental Protection Act. So the BC government wants to say it can require new permits for any company that wants to increase heavy oil shipments, not just by pipeline, but also by rail or truck. So it's a new rules they want to put in place on transporting heavy oil through this province. They would basically require that you can meet certain safety restrictions and requirements, and that you can prove the ability to clean up a spill if there is one. And this is one of the big contentions of the BC government, that we don't actually know what will happen if diluted bitumen flows into the salt water of the Burrard Inlet. And can you clean it up after? So the hint is, this is the way to kill the pipeline, but it's not trying to kill the pipeline. It's trying to regulate the environment, which is a shared jurisdiction. Notably, this does not discuss tankers at all. The province discussed how tankers are clearly in federal jurisdiction. Regulating boats belongs to Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, this is something that you can't even really have a pretense of regulating. It's very clearly a federal jurisdiction.
And I saw some people trying to use that argument as, well, guess it was never about our coastlines anyway, which feels a bit like a cheap shot. I mean, this is focused on if oil spills at like the edge of the land and it happens to go into the coast, well, it's kind of on both sides, like it'll land on some of the land.
Yeah, and the thing is, like the regulations that the BC government can put in place basically stop at the coastline, which means anything floating off of it is entirely federal jurisdiction, so they just can't control the tanker traffic.
So for the legal nerds who listen to the show, who we have hopefully convinced to listen to the show with our last few times we've had Micah on, the question itself is going to the British Columbia Court of Appeal and asks actually 3 questions. First, they ask, does the province have the legislative authority to put these amendments in place? And they just sort of slap them on as an attachment in the appendix. The second question is, if the answer to 1 is yes, would this legislation be applicable to hazardous substances brought into BC by means of interprovincial undertakings, aka a pipeline?
Or a railroad.
Yeah. And if the answer to 1 and 2 are yes, would existing federal legislation render all or part of the proposal inoperative? So if we could theoretically do this, is there anything else there that would prevent us from doing it? Honestly, it seems like the best way they had to ask this. I think what probably took the longest was the government tooling around with the proposed amendments itself. And I don't think either of us have the expertise to really get into those.
Yeah, none of us are experts on oil regulations, but these seem like not unreasonable questions for the government to ask.
Like, the province already does regulate the transport of oil and other materials through the province. I remember Christy Clark shutting down like the railways for coal briefly as like part of a trade war she had last year. And I remember vaguely, I'm probably getting part of that story
I think it
wrong.
had to do with, it was something about cold coming in from Washington, I think. It was right around the election last year. But like you, it's one of those final acts of the Christie Clark government that just didn't really stick around, either in practice or in one's head.
I think the key takeaway here, though, is that this reference question will go to the Court of Appeal, and, well, the court can probably prioritize reference questions, and this isn't a question that needs weeks and weeks of hearings. The government will present its position, the federal government and probably Alberta and others will get a chance to submit their responses, and then the court just has to go and think about it for a while. Then they'll come back and give their response. But Horgan, announcing this question, readily admits that this won't probably be done by May 31st, which is the arbitrary deadline Kinder Morgan gave. And even if it is, if BC wins, the regulations do look like they would first have to then pass the act, create the regulations surrounding it, which they're still in consultations for right now, preemptively, and then ask Kinder Morgan to apply for another set of permits, all of which, if I'm sitting in Kinder Morgan's board room and I've already said, give me certainty by May 31st, this is a good no to that certainty. I don't know how it plays for Alberta and Canada. They haven't put out responses yet that I've seen.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the Alberta Attorney General's office is still looking over this and figuring out what their filings on this are going to be, because they will no doubt seek intervener status.
And Alberta's response is going to be interesting to watch because they are simultaneously arguing that they have the authority to restrict the amount of crude oil that flows out of Alberta into BC as part of their threats to us. So they both want provincial jurisdiction over the flow of product to another province and want other provinces to not have it. It's classic federalism. So yeah, the next step, I guess, is to just wait and see what Canada and the other provinces respond with and how long this all takes to go to court. If Canada and Trudeau step up and really try to push the pipeline through, I guess that could render this whole question a bit moot. But I don't know, Trudeau says the pipeline will be built, and there's been like subtle hints that we wouldn't say we won't use the military to clear a path for protesters. But is he his father?
He's not going to call in the military. At most, it'll be the RCMP. And even that, I think, is fairly unlikely. More likely he'll just use what powers he has to, push the province's objections out of the way.
Well, and the path that Trudeau and Notley seem to be taking at least seems to be building public support. Main Street was out with a poll this week showing that now 55% of British Columbians are in support of the pipeline versus 39% who are opposed to it, which is similar numbers to what we talked about last week. Again, support is strongest for men, people over 65, people who live in the interior, and opposition is young people, women, and those who live on Vancouver Island. All the stereotypes, I guess, hold true. What else is in there is that 48% of British Columbians are apparently less likely to vote at NDP because of the opposition to the pipeline, and that's apparently costing him votes in Greater Vancouver and the interior. So the attrition strategy may work to kill the pipeline, but it might actually piss enough people off that it starts to affect the NDP's numbers.
I could definitely see that, especially kind of in the outer ring of Metro Vancouver. That was instrumental in the NDP winning, but at the same time, if the narrative takes hold that the NDP are, the party of no to everything, it might hurt them.
Well, they said yes to Site C. They said yes to LNG, but those are kind of liberal things, and the NDP is never going to get credit for those. At the top line of this poll, though, Main Street reports that the BC Liberals are at about 37%. The NDP are down to 35%. The Greens are sitting around 16%. And the nascent leaderless BC Conservatives are at 11%, which I did ask Guido Maggi about why he includes the BC Conservatives on Twitter, and he got very defensive. And so I didn't mean to offend him. I just think when a party gets 0.5% in the last election and has no leader, it's not necessarily the most legitimate party to include.
And ran less than, 10 candidates?
I think it was 10 exactly. But yeah.
Yeah, if you're going to do this, have a third or just technically fourth party thrown in the midst. At least put the Libertarians in. They ran more candidates. Might have even gotten more of the vote. I'd have to double check.
They did not get more of the vote. I remember checking that one time, but it was in the same order of magnitude. But
ballpark, around the same, but much more candidates.
Like, polling is an art and a science, as I think Mario Canseco has told us before. It's very tough to try to figure out when to include a new party or not. I don't think it was justified to include the Conservatives this time because of their past performance, and there's no real sign that they are a thing. But they have the name recognition because there is a federal Conservative Party, and there's probably a bunch of BC Liberal voters who are just like, well, I'll put my name there so that it'll move Wilkinson to the right more. Or they might just be people who'd otherwise stay home. Anyway, top line being, numbers aren't great for John Horgan right now. I guess he's still waiting to get past the pipeline, maybe bring his other legislation in the fall and get back on track. But perhaps the other thing that's hurting him, though, is the skyrocketing gas prices in Metro Van. Here, I think just outside at the nearest gas station, it's like $158.9 today. And luckily, I don't have to fill up, although my wife does drive to work. And so people are naturally assuming, hey, maybe we should build that second pipeline to reduce gas prices in Vancouver. Horgan was asked about this, and he got really defensive. He really doesn't see Kinder Morgan as touching gas prices at all. And his argument, I don't think, is unsound. His focus is, if we build that pipeline, that's shipping oil to Asian markets who, if they do refine it, or when they refine it, would then have to ship it back to us. And that's a very inefficient process. It's probably not going to save us much money at the pump. He did actually bring up that when he met with Washington Governor Jay Inslee recently, that this issue of supply and refining capacity came up. And he apparently also brought this up with Trudeau and Notley when he met with them a couple weeks ago in their summit that achieved nothing, which all kind of sounds like he's trying to lay some groundwork for a let's build gas refining capacity in Western Canada kind of move.
Which doesn't make a huge amount of sense from several different policy angles. So not only does the same climate arguments against the pipeline apply to a refinery at the end of that pipeline, but it's not like the oil industry has been lacking in capital to invest in these sorts of things. And if there was a business case to build a refinery in Western Canada, we probably would have seen someone try and do it by now.
So on the environmental side, I can side with the radicals that gas refined and burnt in Asia is almost the same as it being done here. You save a little bit of greenhouse gas emissions by not floating heavy oil across the sea, and those boats take a lot of diesel to move. But on Horgan's side, if you do build the refinery before the coastline, that means your pipeline isn't putting your diluted bitumen rate on the sea. You don't have a tanker that can potentially spill and then create an environmental catastrophe. So I can see some environmental reasons that it would be better to refine closer to where you're using it. It also, I think, in a way fits with some of the union job type stuff that John Horgan's been doing. Remember, he eventually sided with Site C, sort of reluctantly, although some people think maybe he was more on that side all along, even though it was very divisive within his caucus. He also had his really strange, to at least the environmental side, position recently on LNG subsidies, going 2 steps farther than the BC Liberals and Christy Clark went on them. And so a made in BC refinery solution, even if not capitalists economically intelligent, could be something he pursues.
We should do all the value add stuff in Canada. It's been a staple of NDP policy for a long time, so it's not that surprising to see an NDP government sort of test the waters for it.
It would create jobs, and it'd be hard for people to say he's the man of no if he's literally building giant refineries. He runs into the problem again, though, of where are you going to build them? because they don't want those in Burnaby, for fuck's sure. You could put them in the interior, but that kind of doesn't really make any sense. It's like halfway to your market. Now, people in the interior do use gas. So they're very early test balloons at best, I think.
And one I have trouble seeing going anywhere. I think the political reality is you're just not going to see a major government-owned fossil fuel project ever again. On the kind of economic side, there isn't much appetite for those sorts of major government projects where the private sector kind of already exists, and on the environmental side would piss off everyone immensely on that and completely destroy any pretense of actually meeting our climate targets. Yeah, I think the chance that we're going to nationalize our oil refining capacity are pretty much zero.
Well, and even, as you say, a private oil refining capacity is unlikely to happen, even with some of the subsidies that we're throwing around for LNG these days, apparently. We just all need electric cars sooner.
Or actually, in the case of Vancouver, public transit, because like cars have a geometry problem in cities. Moving on to our second segment, putting Betty from Suit out of business. So the BC government today unveiled their proposed cannabis legislation, and the Cannabis Control and Licensing Act will set 19 as the provincial minimum age, which has already been announced. Allow adults to possess up to 30 grams of cannabis in a public place. As well, it'll take the areas that are currently prohibited from smoking tobacco or vaping and also apply that prohibition to cannabis. So that includes playgrounds, sports fields, skate parks, which, yeah, that's not going to be followed at all, as well as places where children commonly gather, and will prohibit the use of cannabis on school property and in vehicles. And for the home growers among us who are wondering how much they're going to be allowed to grow, it's 4 cannabis plants per household. However, they can't be visible from public spaces off the property.
I think this is related to that debate Parliament had briefly over the 1 meter height limit, which everyone kind of went, that's such a random number, because if you've seen a cannabis plant, some of them grow quite tall. And I guess the 1 meter line was actually just like the average height of a fence in Canada, which is so random. And so don't quote me on this, but I think Parliament repealed that segment of their proposed legislation. And so just the keep it out of sight, as though seeing a cannabis plant will... I still don't quite understand the logic on this one, but
it's weird. It's one of the weird cultural hangups I guess some people have around cannabis. Although interestingly, it's visible from public spaces off the property. So does that mean if you're in a strata and it's visible from the communal strata area, it's okay?
It gets weird with stratas because they're also letting stratas pass their own rules about cultivation and smoking.
Yeah, but assuming that's not going to be there. Yeah, just interesting little question. Additionally, it will establish a cannabis retail and licensing regime similar to the current liquor regime with all of its downsides.
Well, the big thing they showed off today was the logo for BC cannabis stores, which was immediately polarizing on Twitter, but not quite.
Is anyone for it?
I am not against it. I actually kind of like it. It's the same branding as the BC liquor stores with the word changed to cannabis, which makes actually a lot of sense because...
Yeah, I get that. I'm just polarizing would seem to imply there's people who are very strongly in favor of it, which seems like most of us are like, not bad.
And I think we did not... I don't know this for sure. I'm just hoping we didn't spend the $650,000 developing that branding that I know it was reported Ontario spent on their Ontario Cannabis Stores logo, which is literally that in an OCS in a circle. It's pretty...
Yeah, it would be hard-pressed to be more wasteful when it comes to spending than the Wayne government, so I think we're probably safe on that one.
So the retail market, like you say, has the cannabis stores, and the province is promising or suggesting that they'll have the first stores actually open by the end of the summer. As anyone who's followed the federal debate knows, it was initially hinted at July 1st or suggested, and then as the weight of that massive bill kind of worked its way through Parliament and got hung up, it's now been telegraphed a bit later and later. And so we don't know when it'll be legal, but likely
Probably
by
this year.
September. Yeah. So the big bulk of this bill is definitely setting up that regime. And one of the other bills, the Cannabis Distribution Act, also introduced today, is the full running of these stores. Basically, the government's going to be responsible for distributing cannabis in the same way that it has the monopoly over distributing alcohol, but then public or private stores can resell it. And this has a lot of the home growers and cannabis culture types up in arms because they're good at growing it right now and they want to be allowed to. One thing I did like around the stores is they're doing a couple things to make sure they can try and take existing dispensaries and bring them into this future legal private store market so you don't have to just start over, which makes a lot of sense. And they're also exempting anyone who has minor criminal convictions to be able to open them, because one of the early criticisms was if you ban anyone who's ever been convicted of anything involving pot from being involved in pot sales, you either only have tobacco companies or a black market. Like all the people who know what they're doing, the people who were selling pot, Betty from Souk, should be able to open her store. But they are restricting people charged with heavier crimes like drug trafficking and things like that. So
like, I guess anything that's an indictable offense is
Yeah.
banned, where the summary ones are
I'm
allowed
not
or something like that.
sure the exact line. I think it's probably something like that. So that all seems fairly reasonable. This also brings in, and this is where I think it gets a bit more controversial, a number of new provincial offenses. And there's the third act is changes to the Motor Vehicle Act. So some of the offenses are things that will just range in fines from $2,000 to $100,000, which is quite the range. Or you could get up to 3 to 12 months in prison. The Motor Vehicle Act changes I was looking at today, and they follow a lot of the concerns that Kyla Lee discussed with us a couple weeks back. So I'll refer to that. But basically, the province doesn't exactly know how they're going to test for cannabis impairment on the roadside yet. But Mike Farnworth assures us that the feds have something in the pipeline, as it were, and haven't told the provinces what it is, but they're pretty sure it works. And so it'll be passed along, and we'll all get to see that when it comes out. But if you're found driving under the influence of drugs, you can face a 90-day roadside prohibition from driving, which then you're thrown into that administrative hell that Kyla talked about. And that bit's got a lot of people worried already. And based on the weak science around many of those tests, undoubtedly there'll be some constitutional challenges to follow. And I think some of the statements that Mike Farnworth was making today about this bill will need tweaks as it goes along. I think I saw Kyla posting on Twitter today that highlights that the government doesn't actually know what it's doing in the law. And so when it comes up for a constitutional challenge, the courts are going to look at that and go, were you sure you knew what you were doing? And it doesn't play well for you, which isn't to say he should be like overly confident in saying this is bulletproof, but they're kind of digging themselves a hole here. And I don't know what the other solution is. And the other part on the Motor Vehicle Act is they've also set in place a zero tolerance restriction for the presence of THC in anyone in the graduated driver's licensing program.
Which basically mirrors the alcohol prohibitions on that.
Except THC works entirely different than alcohol in the blood. So THC can last in the blood for a couple days to a couple months. This basically means you just can't smoke cannabis. But not only that, I've seen there's some evidence out there that if you're in the presence of secondhand smoke, you can get THC in your blood. So this could mean if you are in your L or N stages of your driving and you get pulled over and they detect that, you could lose your license, even though you've never smoked and you weren't high when you drove. So this is all promising. It almost makes me feel like the best advice right now is you'll have your option to go to your socialist or private cannabis store, buy your weed, smoke up, but you might almost just want to not do any of that if you plan on driving, especially if you're the kind of person, aka, black or indigenous, who is at greater risk of being pulled over. So that's worrying. So these three bills have the support of the Greens. They've already expressed that this seems like the best way forward. I'm sure more of these finer details and arguably grossly unconstitutional provisions will hopefully get hashed out a bit better in second reading and committee stages. Hopefully some BC Liberals can make some positive contributions, and hopefully even some of the NDP can bring in some better ideas and retool it and improve it as we go. But these bills do come in with just under, I think, about 3 weeks of legislative sitting left. And if these bills don't get passed before the summer, our province is in a bit of a gray zone where the federal government has legalized cannabis, but then there's no provincial rules around it. So there's a deadline, which means the BC government now has to put most of its resources and the legislative time into running these bills through while also giving them a hearty debate. That means that all of their other priorities that haven't been tabled as bills yet probably aren't going to happen.
Or even the many that have been tabled as bills might not make it through by the end of the sitting.
Well, and that's what Justin McElroy points out in a well-done article that we'll link to in the show notes, that even within cabinet right now, there's a number of priorities. There's changes to ICBC that need to happen. Selena Robinson just introduced some big bills the other day about housing and allowing rental-only zoning. And I think Mike Farnworth also introduced a bill today yesterday, tackling some methods around fentanyl and pill presses, which I don't fully understand, but it sounds like an important change to try to give police more tools to tackle that. All those bills have to fight for what limited other attention there is. And then there's other things the NDP actually wanted to do.
Yeah, and I remember at the start of this session, we were kind of speculating on, well, where are the bills? And it turns out they're here now, but it's a little late for some of them.
Yeah, it's been a great week to read new bills, but not a great week for passing them.
Yeah, and if you have significant items, you maybe should try and front load the legislative session a little more, especially for some fairly major ones like the cannabis one. And well, some of the other ones, such as trying to close loopholes in local financing law or local campaign financing laws that admittedly they should have realized at the time, but at least they're playing catch up on now. Okay, maybe those made sense to drop later on in the session as a reaction, if being a little generous to them. But stuff like cannabis, rental-only zoning, those were announced. Well, the rental-only zoning was February with the budget, and before that, there was cannabis has been known about for a year and passed the Commons quite a while ago. So it's you should be able to manage these a little better and get them in earlier, and not be scrambling at the last couple weeks.
It really highlights to some extent the difficulty and difference between governing and opposition. It's very easy to write a mediocre private member's bill when you're in opposition to grandstand on and try and make a point about. So you can drop your campaign finance law 6 times when you're in opposition, but when you get to government, you go, oh, now it actually matters if this thing is written well. Well, apparently not in the municipal level where you can just miss the interim period between elections. But at least now the BC Liberals have put forward a bill on that, and the NDP sound like they're going to probably put forward their own bill anyway, because why would you pass the opposition's bill? But it really seems like they've been struggling to get the staff together, because they did only become government in July. And so there they had to hire all their main staff. Then they had to get ready to run through a bunch of bills in the fall, and they got those through. Then they had to put their researchers onto writing the throne speech, writing the budget, and only now are they really getting into bringing bills forward to the legislature. It is still late, and it's frustrating their agenda, which allows things like 3 weeks of debate about the speculation tax that at least we've mostly not had to deal with for a while, and now multiple weeks of debate about Kinder Morgan. The agenda is being taken away from the government because they weren't ready to argue for the things they want to. So at least now they can start putting some stuff on the table. But when you're in government, it takes a while to get things done, I guess.
The one thing I haven't heard, though, is any speculation about whether or not they're going to try and extend the sitting to try and get some of these through.
Everything I've heard suggests not. The article I think McElroy put out says that the government is trying to talk to the opposition about timing, and the opposition's obviously saying, we're not going to not debate bills because this is how our system works. And honestly, some of these bills need some good debate, especially these cannabis ones. Maybe some of those early bills that they've put through and already passed that are just cleaning up random sections, those are fine to rush through. But yeah, I haven't heard anything about extending the session. I think they can make an argument for it, and they can really make the argument that it was the BC Liberals and Christy Clark especially who hated sitting in the legislature and was famous for talking about how much she hated Victoria. So saying, we want to sit here and do our job when they didn't for 16 years or whatever as they would, they could make that case. Well, moving on to quick takes. First, I really just want to rant about John Horgan's interview. I think it was yesterday, where someone asked him about when are we going to find out what this electoral reform question is going to be. We know that the consultation wrapped up, I think, a month ago now, and David Eby has been working through what he keeps reminding us is a record-setting number of responses. It was like 300,000 people, and I've heard some people try to dismiss it as like fraction of a percent of the electorate, but I think that's a bit unfair. Getting a couple 100,000 people to take an online survey for the government about the nuances of electoral reform is worth celebrating, but
it didn't even tell you if you were a Hufflepuff at the end.
Yeah, unfortunately. So they're working through that, and both the pro-proportional representation side and the anti have been getting increasingly antsy about what is the question going to be? What are the rules going to be? Will corporate and union donations be allowed? Will there be public funding for the campaigns? Everyone is also really pointing out that to do a good referendum takes both a lot of time and a lot of information campaigns because people don't pay attention to these things. The HST referendum, for example, was like 2 years in total debate from the start of the petitioning till the time it was finally voted on.
And a lot of people still didn't have a great idea what HST was at the end of that. And something as complicated as electoral systems, yeah, you need more than a couple months to really dig into it and get the public educated on what the options are. So wait until September. Hell, if they announced the question now, it would be a tight timeline for a referendum.
Well, John Horgan 100% disagrees with you. He told reporters yesterday, I am confident that British Columbians are sophisticated enough to look at options and make decisions. He was saying when we come back in the fall, there will be a question. There will be a yes campaign and a no campaign.
Yeah, and I'm sure that British Columbians are sophisticated enough to look at these and understand the issues. But, you know, people live busy lives, and not everybody's going to rush out and read a big display on what STV is the moment the announcement drops.
And it's a mail-in ballot, so people will have a lower turnout anyway. So if we end up in a situation like PEI where you get something like 10% turnout, it destroys the legitimacy of your referendum.
And people are already trying to get a turnout requirement put in there for the referendum to be binding. Almost certainly not going to happen, but...
No, I think that would require a change in legislation, which they're obviously not going to have time to do. So everyone's super annoyed. This seems to really bias for the status quo, since electoral reform is a somewhat hard argument to make because of the complexities, especially if we end up having a double question like, do you want to keep first past the post? If no, which of these systems do you prefer? And that's how PEI did it, and you rank them. Or I think New Zealand has done it that way too. But then you need to explain 5 different systems. If the government brings forward one system as the no campaign wants, we still have to explain that. And like STV was a relatively complicated system. MMP is not a simple system either. The only simple one is straight proportional, but that's like the worst of the proportional systems. And there's no chance we're going to that, I think.
Hopefully not.
So this seems like we're heading towards a Trudeau level, Mariam Monsef level, kill it by sheer will of incompetence rather than...
Well, that's assuming the Trudeau government didn't purposely tank the process, which I'm pretty sure they did.
Well, yeah, once it became very clear that no one liked
their idea of...
alternate vote.
Yeah, the let's help the Liberals do even better in future elections system. Yeah, they suddenly lost their appetite for it. And you know, there's always been a faction within the NDP that hasn't, or at least within the BC NDP, that hasn't been super thrilled with the idea of electoral reform, because the BC NDP generally wins when the opposition is split, i.e. under a first-past-the-post system, taking advantage of said system.
The only glimmer of hope here is that John Horgan did conclude his comments, I believe, with if people email me and really want a question now, maybe I'll take that to heart and push David Eby to get that out the door. So please email the Premier. We'll put the link in the show notes, and I'll be sending my own letter. But yeah, we need some rules around this referendum, because at this rate, we're going to be stuck with this crappy electoral system forever.
Well, moving on, BC is not the only province that has decided to put a reference case before the courts. Saskatchewan's announced their own reference case regarding the federal government's carbon pricing initiative, or more specifically, their pricing batch stop. And Saskatchewan basically wants to know, hey, can the federal government impose a tax on one province and not another?
The Liberal plan was always an interesting one. It's based on this idea that Justin Trudeau is going to magically get all of the provinces to agree to do a carbon tax their own way in their own province. And honestly, he actually did pretty good. He got 9 of 10 provinces on board, with Saskatchewan being the holdout.
Yeah, although that's probably going to change in a couple weeks when Doug Ford becomes premier, unfortunately.
Or when Jason Kenney becomes the premier of Alberta.
Still got another year on that one, so.
Yeah. But the federal legislation is basically pitched on this model that if you don't have a price, you'll apply $50 a ton to it, or we'll get up to that. And Saskatchewan's argument under Premier Scott Moe is, well, that's applying a different tax to each province, and that's not fair, that's not constitutional, therefore throw it out. I don't know the full constitutional backing for this, but it feels like a little bit of a reach.
No, I could actually see a case, like I'm not a constitutional scholar either, but I could definitely see a case where the federal government's powers are meant to apply to the country and not specific provinces, and it's at the very least against the spirit of the Constitution. Not sure they'll actually have much success with that argument, and I suppose you'd always do the complicated thing of crediting any province's existing ones in, so you technically are taxing everyone, but they all get credits because they have their own price.
Yeah, it feels sort of like an equalization type thing where you're giving each province, in that case, you're giving each province a bit of money based on their economy. It's different.
It's different because that's a discretionary choice on how to spend money. Or quasi-discretionary. It's a formula, but the formula itself is a discretionary choice based on the federal government's spending powers.
For Saskatchewan's part, I guess it is a similar tactic to BC, which is, well, we can stamp our feet for so long, but eventually, unless we're going to just, I don't know, not pay the federal government or demand they not charge this to us or not provide that money, you have to go to the court. And that's a good way to kind of pass the political buck, as it were. And if Saskatchewan loses, well, they don't really have a plan B at this point.
Okay. Well, I'm actually not sure it's the political winner, because it does force they do lose, it forces their hand, whereas the provincial leader running against the federal government's a classic move in provincial politics.
Perhaps also a case of Scott Moe needing some national attention again, because he's still in Brad Wall's long, long shadow. We'll follow Mr. Moe to see how his case turns out, because it's the year of the constitutional reference cases. Well, and finally, while we're on the subject of the federal carbon tax, or Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act as it's officially known, there was a bit of a kerfuffle, as it were, in the House of Commons today, as Conservative MP Pierre Poilievre, who is known for being a bit of a bulldog, got into some trouble with Commons Speaker Jeff Reagan. Poilievre was ranting and starting to ask a question about the carbon plan, and he was holding a set of redacted documents, trying to explain his umbrage over these redactions and how he needs more information from the government. And the speaker, in line with Commons tradition, said there are no props to be used in the legislature, and asked him to put them down. Poilievre said, "Well, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to this government's memo, I can understand why you might mistake them for props." And that was such a good joke that it had to be met with a standing applause and laughter from all Conservative MPs, which then also had to be yelled at and screamed and booed from the other side of the aisle, to the point where the speaker had to kick everyone out, dismiss it, shut it all down, calm everyone down a little bit, give them their time out, suspend parliament for a few minutes before he could return them all, and Poilievre could try his question again. It does remind me of the most famous case of a prop being used in Parliament. I think this is when I think it was a New Democrat MP walked in with a fish and a dead fish and slapped it down to make some point about the federal government's overreach on fishing regulations or something like that.
Yeah, something about the Atlantic fishery, I think.
I'm in favor of props in Parliament. I'm sure it can get out of hand, but
it almost certainly will get out of hand.
A pile of documents where some are redacted is like trivial.
Yeah, that seems actually not that bad.
Also, standing applause and ruckus to the point of having to shut it down is also ridiculous, and that's a pox on all their houses right here. I'm in both sides in that. I'll give credit to Poilievre for actually going this far, because otherwise we wouldn't have actually known, unless you were the kind of person who actually watches Question Period every day, that he was debating about the carbon tax plan today.
Or you're on the mail-in list, because they are hammering that point hard, and I really should get off that because it's...
All political party mailing lists are pretty bad.
Yeah, it's really bad. Sometimes it's worth a good laugh at just how ridiculous it is, but yeah, hopefully the parties can learn to comport themselves better, although I don't have much hope on that one.
Oh, the longest standing criticism of Parliament and the BC and every legislature essentially is they're, especially during Question Period, are so impolite, so loud, and every single one of them throughout time is not a place you'd want to bring children. So I don't hold out any hope for that. At this point, it's a feature, not a bug.
What happened to my friend Betty, who used to serve me very well, not me, but I'm saying hypothetically, Betty from Souk, who used to be able to get me something on a weekend if I needed it. I prefer to support Betty rather than, the Shoppers Drug Mart or Dispensary X or Y.
Well, and finally, for this week's Best of BC Poly, we didn't mention it in segment 2, but we titled that segment after Betty from Souk, because in John Horgan's questions to the media about the new Cannabis Act, he couldn't help but interject some comments about how someone hypothetically would go to buy from Betty from Souk, and now you won't have to do that because there'll be government and private stores everywhere. And he used Betty from Souk as a name like 3 or 4 times. And so someone went and created the Twitter handle instantly at Betty from Souk, BettyFromSooke, and put that Twitter profile out there. And Betty from Souk has been great at answering everyone's questions about where to get good weed. She's non-political.
Honestly, I think my favorite part of the story is the Premier might have accidentally just outed his supplier in a press conference.
Well, and it really shows when I think the final time he mentions Betty from Souk, he's smiling through it. The rest of it, he's kind of serious, and he's saying, I don't mean to be glib. Well, you failed, John. But Betty from Souk. And I'll give credit to Shannon Waters, past guest of the show, at So Bitter So Sweet, for tweeting it out and bringing my attention to this. It was Justin McElroy who tweeted the video. She subtweeted him saying, today the Premier shared this conceit with the hashtag BC Ledge press gallery. We all had a good laugh. And now at Betty from Souk. Gotta love hashtag BC Poly. So, I don't know, go follow at Betty from Souk and find out where you can get some good weed in the Greater Victoria area, I guess.
And that has been Politicos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politicos.ca. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. Support the show and get early access to our interviews at patreon.com/politicos. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.